Boone Delaney had memorized every word of the letter. 3 months of correspondence, every detail planned, every emotion carefully written in neat handwriting that promised a life he'd only dreamed of. He stood at the edge of his property, watching the dust cloud grow larger on the horizon, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of his modest ranch house, and the driver tipped his hat without saying a word. But when the canvas flap pulled back, Boone's breath caught in his throat. 2 women stepped down, identical in every way that mattered. The same auburn hair catching sunlight like copper wire, the same green eyes, the same delicate features that matched the description in every letter he'd received. One moved with quiet grace, her dress pristine despite the long journey, hands folded neatly as she looked around with wide, almost frightened eyes. The other stepped down with purpose, her identical dress somehow appearing more wrinkled, her chin raised in a way that suggested she feared nothing and no one. They both carried the same worn leather satchel. They both wore the same silver locket around their necks, and when they looked at him, they both smiled with the same mouth he'd imagined kissing on countless lonely nights. "Mr. Delaney?" The gentler one spoke first, her voice soft as morning rain. "I'm Sadie Quinn, your bride." "No," the other interrupted, stepping forward with eyes that held storm clouds. "I'm Sadie Quinn, and I believe there's been some kind of mistake." Boone's hand instinctively moved to the letters in his shirt pocket. 3 months of careful courtship that had led to this moment. But as he looked between the 2 identical women, both claiming the same name, both carrying identical belongings, he realized that everything he thought he knew about his carefully planned future had just shattered like glass. The driver cracked his whip and rolled away without looking back, leaving Boone alone with 2 identical strangers who somehow both knew details about his life that only his true bride should know. Details that were impossible for both of them to possess. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap. Boone's eyes darted from one woman to the other, searching for some difference, some tell that would solve this impossible puzzle. But every freckle, every curve of their faces, every strand of auburn hair seemed perfectly matched. "Ladies," Boone managed, his voice rougher than he intended, "there's clearly been some confusion. Perhaps if we could sit down and sort this out properly." The gentler one, the first to speak, nodded quickly, relief flooding her features. "Of course, Mr. Delaney. I understand this must be overwhelming. In my letters, I mentioned how I helped my aunt with her bakery in Philadelphia before the fire took everything." Boone's blood ran cold. Those exact words had been in the 3rd letter he'd received, written in careful script about family and loss and the hope for a fresh start. "The fire," the other woman said, stepping closer with eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. "The one that started when Mrs. Henderson's chimney caught. I lost everything that day, which is why I answered your advertisement." Her voice carried the same story, but with an edge of steel that made Boone's skin prickle. He pulled the letters from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the first one. "Which of you wrote about the mare named Duchess?" "I did," they both said simultaneously. "And the recipe for buttermilk biscuits that your grandmother taught you?" "That was me," came the chorus again, neither woman backing down. Boone studied their faces, looking for any crack in their certainty. The gentler one bit her lower lip, a gesture that seemed nervous and genuine. The stronger one held his gaze without flinching, her jaw set in a way that dared him to question her. "This is impossible," he muttered, running a hand through his dark hair. "How can you both know these things? How can you both have the same name, the same story, the same face?" The stronger one interrupted. "Because we're sisters, Mr. Delaney. Twin sisters, and it seems someone has played a very cruel joke on all of us." The word sisters hit Boone like a physical blow. Twin sisters, both claiming to be his bride, both knowing intimate details from months of correspondence. His mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. "But the name," he pressed. "You can't both be Sadie Quinn." The gentler one looked down at her hands. "My name is Sadie Quinn," she said softly. "And mine," the other said firmly, "is Rosalie Dean. But the letters I wrote were signed Sadie Quinn." Boone felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "You mean you've been pretending to be someone else?" Rosalie's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "I mean someone has been using both our names, both our stories, for reasons we don't yet understand. The question is, Mr. Delaney, who do you think is really supposed to be here?" Before Boone could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley, and his blood turned to ice when he recognized the rider leading them. Thorn Shepherd dismounted his black stallion with the smooth confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. Two other riders flanked him, their hands resting casually on their gun belts, in a way that suggested they weren't just ranch hands. Thorn's pale eyes swept over the scene before him, Boone standing between two identical women like a man caught in a trap. "Well, well," Thorn drawled, removing his hat to reveal silver-streaked hair that caught the afternoon sun. "Appears congratulations are in order, Delaney. Though I have to say, I wasn't expecting such abundance in your matrimonial arrangements." Boone's jaw tightened. "This is a private matter." "Shepherd, you're not welcome here." "Now that's where you're wrong." Thorn's smile never reached his eyes as he approached the small group. "You see, I have a vested interest in your little domestic situation, especially considering the debt you owe me." "What debt?" Sadie asked quietly, stepping slightly behind Boone. Rosalie, however, moved forward, her green eyes studying Thorn with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. "You're the man who's been trying to buy this land." Thorn's eyebrows rose with mock surprise. "Smart girl. Yes, I've made Mr. Delaney several generous offers for this property, offers he's foolishly refused." He turned back to Boone with the expression that had lost all pretense of friendliness. "But now that you've got yourself hitched, or double-hitched as it appears, well, that changes the legal situation considerably." "How so?" Boone demanded. "Marriage contracts, my friend. Debts transferred to spouses. Community property laws." Thorn circled them slowly like a vulture. "Of course, there's also the small matter of fraud, bigamy, immigration irregularities." His gaze fixed on the twins. "Unless, of course, these ladies can prove their legitimate right to be here." Boone felt anger surge through his chest. "You son of a—" "Easy there," one of Thorn's men said, his hand moving to his weapon. But it was Rosalie who surprised them all by laughing, a sound sharp as breaking glass. "You orchestrated this," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "The letters, the confusion, all of it. You needed Boone in a legally compromised position." Thorn's smile widened. "That's quite an accusation from a woman who admits to traveling here under false pretenses." "We didn't admit to anything," Sadie said, her soft voice suddenly steady. "We said someone used our names, someone who knew details about our lives that only family would know." "Family," Rosalie repeated, her eyes never leaving Thorn's face. "Or someone who's been watching us for a very long time." The pieces began falling into place in Boone's mind, like dominoes toppling in sequence. The too convenient timing of the letters, the identical knowledge both women possessed, the way Thorn had appeared just moments after their arrival. "You bastard," Boone breathed. "You had them followed. You copied their letters, their stories. Prove it," Thorn challenged. But before anyone could respond, Sadie gasped and pointed toward the house. "There's someone inside." All eyes turned toward Boone's house, where a shadow moved past the window with deliberate purpose. Boone's hand instinctively reached for the rifle that wasn't there. He'd left it inside, never expecting to need protection on what should have been the happiest day of his life. "Stay behind me," he ordered the women, but Rosalie was already moving toward the house with the determined stride of someone who feared nothing. "Rosalie, don't," Sadie whispered, but her sister was beyond hearing. Thorn's laugh cut through the tension like a blade. "How exciting. It seems your homecoming has even more surprises than anticipated." Boone ignored him, his focus entirely on the figure that had now appeared in his doorway. A woman stepped onto the porch, tall, elegant, with graying hair pulled back severely and clothes that spoke of money and authority. She surveyed the scene before her with the cold assessment of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thorn called out with genuine pleasure. Perfect timing, as always. The older woman's gaze settled on the twins, and something flickered across her features. Recognition, perhaps, or satisfaction. "Mr. Shepherd, I see our arrangement has proceeded exactly as planned." Sadie made a small, strangled sound. "Aunt Margaret." The woman's attention snapped to her. "Hello, Sadie." "Rosalie." Her voice carried no warmth, only the tired resignation of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary task. "What are you doing here?" Rosalie demanded, but even her fierce confidence seemed shaken by this unexpected reunion. "Cleaning up your father's mess, as I've been doing for the past 20 years. Margaret Whitmore stepped down from the porch, her movements precise and controlled. He owed Mr. Shepherd a considerable sum before his death. Money that doesn't simply disappear because the debtor is no longer with us." Boone felt the world tilting around him. What does this have to do with me? With my bride? Your bride, Margaret said with bitter amusement, was never real, Mr. Delaney. The letters, the correspondence, the careful courtship, all fabricated to bring you into a legally binding contract with not one but two women of questionable status. That's impossible, Boone protested. I received letters for months. Personal details, stories. Stories I provided, Margaret interrupted. Every word carefully crafted from years of watching my nieces, cataloging their lives, their dreams, their secrets. Information that became quite valuable when Mr. Shepherd required leverage against a stubborn rancher who refused to sell his land. Sadie's face had gone pale as moonlight. You used us. You sold our stories, our lives. I saved your lives, Margaret snapped. Your father's gambling debts would have seen you both in far worse circumstances than this. At least here, one of you might find a decent husband. Rosalie stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. You mean you delivered us like cattle to be sold? But it was Thorn who answered, his voice smooth as silk over steel. Not sold, my dear. Traded. Your aunt's debts for your compliance. Mr. Delaney's land for his legal troubles. Everyone gets what they need. Except, Boone said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. I don't recall agreeing to any of this. Thorn's smile widened. Which brings us to the beauty of the situation. You're now married, or about to be, to women who traveled here under false pretenses. That makes you an accessory to fraud, unless of course you'd prefer to sell your land and walk away clean. The trap was perfect, elegant in its cruelty. But as Boone looked at Sadie's frightened face and Rosalie's blazing anger, he realized something that Thorn hadn't counted on. He was falling in love with both of them. The realization hit Boone like a physical blow as he watched Sadie's quiet strength emerge beneath her gentle exterior, and Rosalie's fierce protection of her sister, despite their impossible circumstances. These weren't pawns in someone else's game. They were women who had been betrayed as thoroughly as he had. There's something you didn't count on, Shepherd, Boone said, his voice carrying a calm that surprised even him. Oh? And what's that? I'm not walking away. Thorn's confidence flickered for the first time. Don't be a fool, Delaney. You have no legal standing. These women can't prove they're here legitimately. Then I'll marry both of them. The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Margaret Whitmore's composed facade cracked. Thorn's men shifted nervously. Even Sadie and Rosalie stared at him in shock. That's not legal, Thorn sputtered. But announcing my intention to do so creates enough legal confusion to tie up your fraud charges for months. Maybe years. Boone stepped closer to the twins, his decision crystallizing with each word. And in the meantime, I keep my land. These ladies get protection from whatever debts you claim they owe. And you get to explain to a federal judge why you've been trafficking women across state lines for debt collection. Margaret's face went white. You don't understand the forces you're challenging. Try me. But it was Rosalie who spoke next, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. There's something else you all don't know. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a leather portfolio tied with ribbon. Our father didn't just leave debts when he died. She untied the ribbon with deliberate slowness, letting the papers unfold. He left us mineral rights to a silver claim in Colorado that's been producing steadily for 2 years. The silence that followed was deafening. That's impossible, Margaret breathed. He lost everything gambling. He lost everything you knew about, Sadie said quietly, stepping beside her sister. But he never told you about the claim he filed under our mother's maiden name. We only discovered it after his death when the lawyers contacted us. Thorn's face had gone from confident to calculating to something approaching panic. How much? Enough, Rosalie said with grim satisfaction. To pay whatever debts you claim we owe. Buy this ranch twice over. And still have enough left to make life very uncomfortable for anyone who's been manipulating us. Margaret stepped backward, her composure finally cracking completely. You're lying. You have no money or you wouldn't have answered a mail-order bride advertisement. We didn't answer any advertisement, Sadie said, her soft voice carrying steel. We came here because someone was writing letters in my name to a stranger, and we wanted to know why. Boone felt pieces clicking into place. You came here to investigate. We came here, Rosalie said, to find out who was stealing our identities and why. We never expected to find ourselves in the middle of a land grab. Thorn's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he realized all eyes were on him. This changes nothing. You still can't prove fraud. Actually, a new voice called from behind them. I think they can. Everyone turned to see a man in a dusty coat approaching on horseback, a silver badge glinting on his chest. Behind him rode two more men, their rifles visible in their saddle holsters. "Marshal Pierce?" Thorn said, his voice carefully controlled. "What brings you out this way?" The marshal dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. "Received some interesting telegrams about missing women and forged correspondence. Seems there's been quite a bit of mail fraud happening in these parts." He looked directly at Margaret Whitmore. "Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you have some explaining to do." Margaret Whitmore's carefully constructed composure shattered like ice on a warm morning. "Marshal, I can explain." "I'm sure you can, ma'am. But first I'd like to hear from these young ladies." Marshal Pierce's weathered face was kind, but firm as he approached Sadie and Rosalie. "Miss Quinn, Miss Dean, I presume?" "You know our real names," Rosalie said, surprise flickering across her features. "Received a telegram from a lawyer in Philadelphia 3 days ago. Seems someone's been impersonating you ladies in correspondence across 3 states. We've been tracking this operation for weeks." Thorn's face had gone ashen, but his voice remained steady. "Marshal, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Pierce interrupted, "is how long you thought you could run this scheme before getting caught." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got a warrant here for mail fraud, conspiracy, and trafficking. That's just the beginning." Boone stepped forward, his mind racing. "How many others? How many men like me?" 7 that we know of. All ranchers or property owners who refuse to sell, all suddenly faced with legal complications involving fraudulent marriages or questionable business partners. The marshal's eyes hardened. Clever system. Create problems that could only be solved by selling land at well below market value. Sadie moved closer to Boone, her shoulder brushing his arm. The simple contact sent heat through his chest, and he noticed how she seemed to seek his protection instinctively. "What happens to us now?" "Well, miss, that depends on what you want to happen." Rosalie stepped between them, her green eyes fierce. "We want justice, and we want to make sure no one else gets hurt by these people." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Justice? You two have no idea what justice costs. Your father's debts are real, girls. The money he owed doesn't disappear because you've inherited some mining claim." "Actually," Pierce said mildly, "it does. Especially when those debts were acquired through illegal gambling operations that Mr. Shepherd here was running out of the back room of his saloon." The revelation hit like lightning. Thorn's illegal gambling had created the debts that gave him leverage over the families. The mail fraud scheme was just the mechanism to collect on land he couldn't legally seize. "You son of a bitch," Boone breathed, understanding flooding through him. "You created the debts, then offered the only solution." But Thorn was already moving, his hand snapping to his gun with practiced speed. "Nobody's taking anything from me." The metallic sound of his weapon clearing leather froze everyone except Marshal Pierce, whose own gun appeared in his hand with the fluid motion of long experience. "Drop it, Shepherd." For a heartbeat, time balanced on a knife's edge. Then Thorn's eyes shifted to Sadie, standing closest to him, and his gun swung toward her with deadly intent. "If I can't have the land, nobody can." Boone threw himself forward without thinking, his body moving between the gun and Sadie. But it was Rosalie who reached them first, tackling her sister to the ground just as the thunder of gunfire split the afternoon air. Through the smoke and chaos, Boone saw Thorn stumble backward, clutching his shoulder as Marshal Pierce's deputies moved in. But his relief was short-lived when he heard Rosalie's sharp cry of pain. Blood was spreading across her dress where Thorn's wild shot had found its mark. Blood soaked through Rosalie's dress like spilled wine on white cloth, and Boone's world narrowed to the spreading red stain across her left shoulder. She was conscious but pale, her fierce green eyes now clouded with pain and shock. "Get her inside," Boone commanded, scooping Rosalie into his arms with surprising gentleness for a man of his size. Her head fell against his chest, and he could feel her trembling despite her attempts to appear strong. Sadie ran ahead, throwing open the door to the ranch house and clearing the kitchen table with swift efficiency. "Put her here," she directed, her soft voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. As Boone lowered Rosalie onto the table, their eyes met for a moment that felt suspended in time. Even wounded, even vulnerable, she looked at him with a intensity that made his breath catch. "Don't you dare look at me like I'm dying," she whispered, but her usual fire was dampened by pain. "Wouldn't dream of it," Boone replied, but his hands shook as he helped Sadie examine the wound. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of Rosalie's shoulder, missing bone and major arteries by what looked like mere inches. Sadie worked with practiced efficiency, tearing cloth for bandages and applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "You know medicine?" Boone asked. "Our mother was a midwife," Sadie explained without looking up from her work. "She taught us both, but Rosalie was always too impatient to learn properly." "I was not," Rosalie protested weakly, then winced as Sadie probed the wound. "I just had better things to do than memorize which herbs stopped bleeding. Like getting into fights with boys twice your size," Sadie said, but her voice carried deep affection beneath the worry. Outside, they could hear Marshal Pierce giving orders to his deputies and the sound of chains as Thorn and Margaret were shackled for transport. The immediate danger was over, but Boone realized that the most complicated part of this situation was just beginning. He was in love with both sisters. The realization had crystallized in the moment he'd seen Rosalie throw herself in front of a bullet meant for Sadie, and again when he'd watched Sadie's gentle competence as she cared for her wounded sister. Two halves of something he'd never known he was missing. "Boone," Rosalie said quietly, grabbing his wrist with her uninjured hand. "I need to tell you something. About why we really came here." Sadie's hands stilled on the bandage she was wrapping. "Rosalie, don't—" "She needs to know," Rosalie insisted, her eyes never leaving Boone's face. "We didn't just come to investigate the letters. We came because—" She took a shaky breath. "Because we were both already in love with you." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a spent match. Boone stared at her, then at Sadie, whose face had turned the color of fresh roses. "We read every letter you wrote," Sadie whispered, "even though they were addressed to someone else, even though we knew it was wrong. Your words, your thoughts, the way you described your life and your dreams. We both fell in love with the man who wrote those letters." Boone's mind reeled. "But I wrote to Sadie Quinn. I thought I was writing to one person. You were writing to both of us," Rosalie said with a weak smile. "Margaret made sure both our stories ended up in those letters. She just never counted on us falling in love with you in return." Before Boone could respond, Marshal Pierce appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Mr. Delaney, we've got a problem. Thorn's escaped." Marshal Pierce's words sent ice through Boone's veins. "How is that possible? I saw your deputies arrest him. Thorn's men created a distraction. Cut him loose while we were securing Mrs. Whitmore." Pierce checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "He's wounded, desperate, and knows these hills better than we do. Makes him extremely dangerous." Boone moved to the window, scanning the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him uncomfortably of blood. "He'll come back for revenge. That's what I'm counting on," Pierce said grimly. "We've got men positioned around the property. When he shows himself, he won't come for a straight fight," Rosalie interrupted from the table, her voice weak but certain. "Thorn spent years manipulating people from the shadows. He'll try something clever." As if summoned by her words, the sharp crack of breaking glass echoed from the back of the house, followed immediately by the acrid smell of smoke. "Fire!" Sadie gasped, rushing to the window. "He's trying to burn us out." Boone could see orange flames already licking at the barn through the kitchen window. If the fire spread to the house, they'd be forced outside, where Thorn could pick them off one by one. "We need to get Rosalie out of here," Boone decided, moving toward the table. "I can walk," she protested, but when she tried to sit up, her face went white with pain. "Like hell you can." Boone scooped her up again, this time noting how she didn't argue, just wrapped her good arm around his neck and pressed her face against his shoulder. "Marshal, can your men cover us to the corral?" Boone asked. "The horses are already spooked by the fire," Pierce replied, peering out the window. "But there's something else. Look." Through the smoke they could see movement near the burning barn. Not Thorn, but his remaining men, closing in from multiple directions with rifles raised. "He's got us surrounded," Sadie breathed. That's when Boone heard it, the distinctive whistle he'd learned as a boy, the same signal his father had used when calling cattle. It was coming from the direction of the fire, low and mournful, but it wasn't a cattle call. "That bastard," Boone muttered, understanding flooding through him. "He's not just trying to burn us out. He's using the fire to stampede my horses directly toward the house." The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, and through the smoke they could see his entire herd, nearly 30 horses, charging directly toward them in blind panic, driven by the flames behind them and Thorn's men on the flanks. "He means to trample us," Pierce realized with horror. Boone looked at Rosalie in his arms, then at Sadie standing pale but determined beside him. These women had risked everything to find the truth, had been betrayed by their own family, and now faced death because of his stubborn refusal to sell his land. But as he watched the wall of panicked horses bearing down on them, Boone made a decision that surprised even him. "Sadie, can you handle a rifle?" "Better than most men," she replied without hesitation. "Then cover the windows. Marshal, your men need to focus on Thorn's riders." Boone moved toward the door, still carrying Rosalie. "I'm going to stop this stampede." "That's suicide," Pierce protested. Boone smiled, and for the first time in hours it reached his eyes. "No, Marshal. That's ranching." Boone stepped onto the porch with Rosalie still in his arms, facing the wall of panicked horses thundering toward them. Behind him, he could hear the sharp crack of Sadie's rifle as she picked off Thorn's men with deadly precision. "Put me down," Rosalie whispered urgently. "You can't stop them while carrying me." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to." Her green eyes met his with fierce intensity. "Trust me." Against every instinct, Boone set her gently against the porch railing. Then he stepped into the yard and did something that would have seemed impossible to anyone who didn't understand horses. He began to sing. The low, rhythmic melody his father had taught him years ago. Not the sharp whistle that spooked animals, but the deep, calming tune that gentled even the wildest mustang. His voice carried over the thunder of hooves. And slowly, impossibly, the lead horses began to slow. But Thorn wasn't finished. Through the smoke came his voice, raised in fury. "Kill them all!" The crack of his rifle sent splinters flying from the porch beam inches from Boone's head. Thorn emerged from behind the burning barn, his wounded shoulder making his aim unsteady but his desperation making him deadly. That's when Sadie appeared beside Boone, rifle in hand, her gentle exterior replaced by cold determination. "This ends now." Her shot took Thorn in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the dirt. He tried to raise his weapon one last time, but Marshal Pierce's bullet finished what Sadie had started. Thorn Shepherd would manipulate no more families, steal no more land, destroy no more lives. The horses, responding to Boone's continued singing, had slowed to a nervous milling around the yard. The fire was already dying, as Pierce's men doused it with water from the well. The immediate danger was over. But the question that had haunted Boone since the moment two identical women stepped off that wagon remained unanswered. "I need to tell you both something," he said, turning to face Sadie and Rosalie. "I'm in love with you, both of you, and I don't know how to choose between you." The sisters exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared secrets and unspoken understanding. "Then don't," Rosalie said softly. "What?" Sadie stepped forward, taking his hand. "We've talked about this, Boone. While you were worried about the law and the land and Thorn's schemes, we were talking about what we really wanted. We want to stay," Rosalie continued. "Both of us. Together. This ranch is big enough for 3 people who care about each other. But I can't marry you both," Boone protested. "It's not legal." "Marry Sadie," Rosalie interrupted. "She's the one who needs the legal protection. I'm strong enough to make my own way in the world." She smiled, and despite her wound, it was radiant. "But that doesn't mean I'm leaving. This feels like home." Sadie blushed, but didn't contradict her sister. "If you'll have us both in whatever way works. We're tired of being alone, Boone. All 3 of us. Standing there in the fading light, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, but looking toward a future none of them had planned. Boone realized that sometimes the best solutions were the ones that broke all the rules. 3 months later, the marriage of Boone Delaney and Sadie Quinn was the talk of 3 counties. Not because of the bride, but because of the maid of honor who stayed on to help run the ranch. Neighbors whispered, but the 3 of them were too happy to care. Marshal Pierce visited occasionally, always commenting on how well the ranch was doing under its unusual management. Margaret Whitmore served 2 years in federal prison for mail fraud, and Thorn Shepherd's schemes died with him in the dirt behind Boone's barn. Sometimes love doesn't follow the rules. Sometimes it writes its own. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.